Excellencies, dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to who is with us on WebEx and to who is now joining us on Facebook Live. The Geneva Environment Network has the pleasure to welcome you today virtually for the 6th session of the Geneva Bit Plastic Pollution Dialogues, organized in collaboration with the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Convention Secretariat, the Center for International Environmental Law, the Global Governance Center at the Graduate Institute, and the governments of Norway and of Switzerland. For those who wouldn't yet know our platform, we are a network of more than 100 institutions and secretariats based in Geneva that make this region one of the global hubs for environmental governance. Administrated by the United Nations Environment Programme and supported by Switzerland, we organize various networking activities, including regular multi-stakeholder roundtables and briefings on major environmental trends. The Geneva Bit Plastic Pollution Dialogues aim at linking different plastic issues to the governance question and encourage increased engagement in the run-up to various global environmental negotiations that will take place this year and next year. We want to understand how we are using specific global instruments to address the plastics crisis and how we could use them better. The first session focused on plastics and waste, the second on plastics, climate and air pollution, the third on issues related to human rights, the fourth session on plastics and health, and the last session last week on plastics and standards. These sessions recommended to adopt a life cycle approach to the plastic crisis and work on comprehensive responses that integrate environmental, human rights, and health concerns. Life cycle is the topic of the session we will hold next week. They also recommended to reinforce, adapt, and coordinate existing instruments to address plastics and chemical additives, to support a global legally binding agreement that addresses the entire plastics life cycle, to foster circularity by developing regional and national processes, including extended producer responsibility, to reduce the production of plastics and stop the development of new petrochemical infrastructure, to support scientific research on plastics and its impacts in relation to various fields, to disseminate information and communicate effectively on the impacts of plastics, to further develop standards on plastics and also harmonize terminology and MARPOP equivalences between standards, further develop standards on plastics with a systematic approach, develop simple labeling systems and improve consumer information. And I could go on with a few more. I will stop here. Before all these, the resources and the outcomes of these sessions are available online on the website, on our website. Before I give the floor to today's moderator who will guide you through this session, let me briefly introduce you to our panel. We have with us His Excellency Ambassador Chad Blackman, the permanent representative of Barbados to the United Nations and other international organizations in Geneva, who is also the chair of the WTO Committee on Trade and Environment. We have also with us Jean-Marie Pogam, the permanent representative of France to the World Trade Organization and the former chair of the World Trade Organization Committee on Trade and Environment. Leading the work of the World Trade Organization on Trade and Environment, Heike Hoelim is with us. From the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Convention Secretariat, we have with us Amélie Taufik. From UNCTAD, working within the Division on International Trade and Commodities, we have with us David Vivas, Mr. Blue Economy, among others. We have also with us from the International Institute for Sustainable Development, Alice Tipping, who is leading the work of ISD on fisheries subsidies. We have with us Caroline Dierbierbeck, a senior researcher at the Global Governance Center of the Graduate Institute in Geneva. And Alice is one of Alice Center is one of the co-organizers of the Bit Plastic Pollution Dialogues. Not only the center, but of course, Caroline has also put a lot of energy in the preparation of these sessions. And finally, Stephen Stone, the chief of the Resource and Markets branch of the United Nations Environment Programme, whose team is leading the organization work on trade and environment issues. And he is our moderator today and will guide you throughout the session. Before I give him the floor, let me also remind you that the video of this event, the presentations made, as well as a summary, will be available online on the webpage of this event. You can raise your questions in the Q&A box throughout the event. and we will address them in the last part of this session. Stephen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Diana. You've done half my job because you've introduced the wonderful panel that we have today. And I'm so glad that you're with us because we have a really important topic to explore, which is looking at the interface between trade and plastics. It's not an easy issue. It's not a straightforward issue. We know that plastics is one of the major issues of our time. We know there's over 300 million tons of plastic waste produced every year, according to UNEP. We also know an astounding fact that of all the plastic produced, more than half has been produced since the year 2000. So it's a budding issue. It's an emerging issue. It's an issue that we have to come to grips with. And on the side of trade, of course, trade is just such a huge part of our economy. 1/3 of global GDP is traded, more or less. And with COVID, a huge shock to trade. We saw trade contracting by 9 or 10% last year. So even questions around how resilient are my value chains? What is the role of localization? What is the role of sufficiency? How can trade further the goals that we need to work towards, including in this case, controlling better our plastic waste? There's a lot of action on behalf of governments around the world. We saw China in 2018, the tail end of 2018, impose unilateral restriction on trade waste, plastic waste. But they're certainly not alone. Countries around the world are looking at the issue of single-use plastic products, and essentially plastic that's essentially waiting to become waste after it's used once. So it's a huge issue. And for those of us who care about trade and the role of trade in building resilience and building prosperity going forward, it's one that we really need to figure out. So I'm delighted to have a panel of very esteemed and knowledgeable colleagues to help us tease out the nuances and some of the possible ways forward to explore the upsides in terms of trade governance in around plastics, and how trade can also be a boon, a plus for our efforts to manage plastic better. So that's our task today, colleagues. And to help us set the scene, I'm going to hand it over to Caroline Dierberbeck. She's a researcher at the Graduate Institute of Geneva and someone who knows so much about these topics. Caroline, help us set the scene and understand what's at stake. And then following Caroline, we'll go straight to Ambassador Blackman, who chairs the Trade and Environment Committee at the WTO, sort of the epicenter of discussions around trade and environment here in Geneva at the WTO. So with that, Caroline, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephen, for the introduction. So my job this morning this afternoon is to set the scene on what does trade have to do with plastic pollution and its governance. So the first point is that plastics economy is global. Both plastic production, consumption, and disposal are all globally distributed. So international trade flows are central to this economy. They're a conveyor belt for plastic products to move around the world, and they're central to the spread of plastic pollution as well. So as business as usual projections are for a quadrupling of plastic production from current levels by 2050, it will come as no surprise that we can also expect a significant expansion of international trade in plastics as well. So in a study that we published today, that UNCTAD published today, Diana Baraklov, Julian Christen, and I provide evidence on the volume and value of international trade, showing that it's significant across the plastic life cycle and global supply chains. So our study showed that the total value of plastics trade in 2018 was more than $1 trillion US, more than 5% of global trade. We also showed that we need to differentiate trade flows across the life cycle of plastics. So we have significant trade flows in fossil fuel feedstocks and additives that are used to manufacture plastics. We have huge flows in virgin primary plastics. So that's the pellets and fibers that plastics are made of. Indeed, exports of primary plastics represented 60% of annual global production in 2018. There's also significant trade in intermediate forms of plastics and in a host of manufactured products, and of course, in waste. So in our study, we highlighted that most standard estimates of plastics trade focus only on a subset of plastics trade. And in our estimate, we showed that there was at least 40% more by value and 25% more by volume than is normally accounted for. And so to help provide this more accurate picture, UNCTAD has developed a prototype database, which will be available to the public in the coming months. We've put in the chat at the study for those of you who are interested. So notably, this database includes trade in items such as synthetic textiles, where trade also represents 60% of global production, and also rubber, such as rubber tires, which are the world's largest source of microplastic pollution. So importantly, our study highlights that from a plastic pollution perspective, the trade challenge is not just related to imports of plastic waste, but also of plastic products that then become waste. So for many developing countries in particular, it's the huge diversity of plastic products and products wrapped in plastics, with plastics embedded in them, that become part of the waste stream that governments have faced with managing, mostly unsuccessfully, and then enter into the oceans as well as river systems, land, public sewage systems, and so on. So critically, in the way that trade is currently classified and measured, it's very difficult to get a handle on a huge segment of plastics that cross international borders. So our study, for instance, doesn't begin to capture the huge amount of trade in pre-packaged products that have plastic packaging as part and parcel of the product that's traded, but are not listed as part of plastics trade per se. It also doesn't capture the huge amount of packaging used for transportation and international distribution. Nor does it cover the millions of tons of plastics embedded in other products. So for instance, trade in cars, 50% of the volume of cars is plastic. So that's also not captured in our study. What it does show, however, is that trade flows are central to the global plastics economy. We need to understand them better at different points along the life cycle in order to understand best where to intervene. It also highlights that it's not going to be enough to address plastic pollution just within your own country. The EU, for instance, is among the top 20 exporters of plastics in every category that we examined. It's the world's largest exporter of virgin primary plastics and also the world's largest exporter of empty plastic packaging. So how is trade policy relevant to all of this? Well, Steve alluded at the beginning to the fact that trade policy can play a central role. It's the main instrument that governments use to manage what goes in and out of their country and on what terms. So importantly, many countries are already taking action at the border and behind the border, using trade policies to support their efforts to tackle plastics pollution. There are import bans on plastic wastes, restrictions on certain single-use plastics. Some countries are implementing export restrictions on plastic waste, and a whole set of environmental standards and labels also impact plastics trade. I know that Ho from the WTO will provide more detail on these points. So what I'd just like to underline here is that the globalized nature of plastics production and distribution mean that there are limits to what governments can accomplish on their own. So current trade-related efforts are disjointed and they're uncoordinated. And piecemeal and non-transparent efforts are far less effective than cooperative and transparent ones. Industries and exporters face difficulties adjusting to new policies and increasingly complex regulatory frameworks in different places in the world. Market-leading companies that are trying to reduce their plastic footprint across supply chains need trade policy frameworks that encourage others to do the same. So at present, however, there's a vast gap in cooperation on these trade-related aspects of promoting a more sustainable plastics economy. Indeed, today, the Basel Convention is the only international arrangement that explicitly addresses trade in plastics with a focus on plastic waste. And I'll leave Amelie to talk more about that. But looking forward, we need to think carefully about how trade policies can help us to phase out unsustainable plastics trade and also to create the right incentives and markets for more sustainable plastics production and for the greater use of substitutes and alternatives. So this means we need to think about how to strengthen trade-related cooperation, such as around the implementation of the Basel Convention's plastic amendments. But it also means that we need to ensure that cooperation on trade dimensions is part of global governance efforts on plastic pollution, including in the proposed UN Global Plastics Pollution Treaty. So our representatives of France and Barbados can provide their views on how governments can work together at the WTO in ways that could complement, support, and add value to other international efforts, such as the Plastic Pollution Treaty proposal. But to close here, and just at my last minute, I wanted to offer just a couple of concrete suggestions on the kinds of trade-related options that governments can consider working on cooperatively, regionally, at the WTO, and in the context of a global plastics pollution treaty. So first, Where countries already restrict or ban certain plastic products domestically, it would make sense that they would restrict exports of those same goods to other countries. Governments could also work together at the regional level on common approaches to trade-related measures that would also help shield them from pressures that might arise in trade negotiations. Governments could look for ways to promote trade in environmentally sustainable waste management technologies and in non-plastic substitutes, which are of strong interest to many developing countries. Trade and environmental policymakers could work together to help identify where international standards on plastics are needed to promote more sustainable plastics trade and how they can boost their transparency. They could explore how aid for trade could support implementation of the Basel amendments and other policies related to plastics and trade. They could provide incentives that support international markets for recycling while cracking down on illegal and unsustainable plastic waste trade. And they could look for ways, the role that trade policy might play in helping to reduce environmentally harmful subsidies that support expanded virgin plastic production. And finally, governments could work together to find ways to see whether they could adopt targets, for instance, to reduce plastic packaging in trade, in prepackaged products, in transportation and distribution. So thank you, Stephen, for the opportunity to be here today. I look forward to hearing from others on the panel.
Thank you, Carolyn. Wonderful tableau that you've set there for us, including not only the challenges, but some possible solutions for us to consider. Regional action on trade governance or standards, building capacity behind the border through aid for trade, working with our colleagues at the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Convention on managing trade flows in plastic waste. Some really interesting statistics too. $1 trillion of plastics traded in 2019, that's mind-boggling. 5% of global trade, which doesn't even include plastics packaging or embedded plastic. So that's definitely a wake-up call for all of us. It's all around us. And to help us understand better the context in which this conversation is taking place at the WTO and at a national level, I'm going to turn to you, Ambassador Blackman, Chair of the Trade and Environment Committee at the WTO, and also representing a country known for its leadership on environmental issues, including the blue economy and many other aspects. Ambassador Blackman, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and good afternoon or good evening to all of you, depending on where you are in the world. I'm certainly pleased to be with you to discuss how the WTO is helping to tackle the issue of plastic pollution. Now, to set some context, last year, a group of WTO members launched the WTO Informal Dialogue on Plastics Pollution and Environmentally Sustainable Plastics Trade. Now, the group held its inaugural meeting during WTO Trade and Environment Week, a yearly event held in conjunction with the WTO Committee on Trade and the Environment, which I have the honor to chair. The Informal Dialogue serves as a groundbreaking effort by a group of WTO members to find ways to improve trade cooperation, to contribute to worldwide efforts to reduce plastics pollution, and also to build a global plastics economy that is circular, safe, and also, very importantly, inclusive. Now, the Informal Dialogue will seek to complement and not duplicate all the good work to tackle plastics pollution around the world, in cities and also local communities, in universities, research labs, and businesses, and the intergovernmental forums such as UNEA and also the Basel Convention and the WCO. Now, there are currently 12 WTO members in the Informal Dialogue, namely Australia, Barbados, Canada, China, Fiji, Ghana, Jamaica, Kazakhstan, Morocco, New Zealand, Switzerland, and Thailand. The dialogue is open to all members, so I'm sure many more will come on board given the importance and also the timing of it as we go forward. Now, the growing focus on sustainable plastics trade at the WTO cannot arrive soon enough, and I really want to repeat that. It cannot arrive soon enough. We are confronting the most acute health crisis in a century, and dare I say, in a few generations, the worst economic crisis in our lifetimes, and the triple planetary crisis of climate, diversity, and pollution. The problem of plastics pollution certainly is not separate from these challenges, and therefore it is intimately connected to all of these that I would have outlined. And therefore, in their effort joint communication to the Committee on Trade and Environment, the co-sponsors of the Informal Dialogue recognize the rising environmental, health, and also economic costs of plastics pollution, and also how the COVID-19 pandemic has amplified these costs. And they highlight that plastics pollution is a concern for all countries and regions, large and small, developed and developing, landlocked, and also coastal states. So we need all hands on deck. And this includes the WTO working side by side with the environmental policy community and all other stakeholders. This interface between the environment community is incredibly important. Last Tuesday, I had the honor to address the ministers of the environment of Latin America and the Caribbean. I reminded them of our joint responsibility as leaders of the trade and environment communities, namely and firstly, to work in concert, not in silos, to craft trade and environment policies that reinforce each other, not policies that work at cross purposes, and also to be active players, not just spectators, in global efforts to seize opportunities that are good for the planet and also good for the trade. The informal dialogues on plastics pollution and environmentally sustainable trade certainly therefore is an opportunity to do just that. It's an opportunity to demonstrate that trade officials are not a concern of citizens around the world, and particularly for that of young people. It's also equally an opportunity to highlight the plastics pollution does not care much for borders. Plastics pollution is global in nature, therefore demands a globally coordinated response on a scale hardly ever seen in human history. And this certainly must be a catalyst for us to move forward in a new direction. The informal dialogue is also an opportunity to show how trade policies can be part of the solution to environmental challenges and not part of the problem. Now, the informal dialogue had a good foundation to build from. First, plastic pollution has been raised as an issue in every single meeting of the WTO Committee on Trade and Environment since November of 2016. So therefore, now we're going into our 5th year, as it were. There has also been useful workshops and also informal consultations, both within and outside of the WTO. Support for action on this very important topic. Several members have shared national experiences and information on trade measures adopted to address challenges and also to promote sustainable plastics and the circular economy. Secondly, the WTO Environmental Database shows the broad range of trade measures used in connection with plastics pollution. This wealth of information provides members of the informal dialogue with a factual basis to consider whether there is scope for coordinated global action to address the trade dimensions of plastics pollution. And finally, and importantly, another group of WTO members has recently embarked on structured discussions on trade and environmental sustainability. I see tremendous synergies between this work and the work of the informal dialogue on plastic pollution. So I encourage all members involved in these initiatives to coordinate closely, not only amongst themselves, but also with the Committee on Trade and Environment. As I have said before in many other fora and presentations, this is a ground zero moment. Years of hard-won development progress can be reversed, and in many respects has been reversed. The challenge before us is not simply to get back on track and recover time lost to the crisis. Instead, we need to shift tracks towards a global economy that works for planet and also people all over the world. I'm heartened by the plastic discussion that we're going on, and also the positive momentum on trade and environment discussions within the WTO. The informal dialogue on plastics pollution is a very clear sign, a very, very clear sign of the willingness and appetite to act. And it would be remiss of me if I didn't say, in terms of my own national capacity, as you would have said, Steve, that Barbados as a country has introduced a ban on single-use plastics, bearing in mind the importance that the impact that it has on our marine life and our ecosystem. And we could only encourage other countries to do so, because if 1 or 2 or 3 or only a few nations take this act, but then the rest of the world is still not engaging in it, we're not making as significant an impact as we possibly can. And it also calls for us to look strategically going forward, and how do we get our private sector to shift from mode of operation and also the supply chains in the heavy use of plastic into a more sustainable mode of engagement for business and services. And therefore, our scientists will have to engage strategically with the private sector and businesses to come up with innovative ways of ensuring that we make that transition. Also, financial players will also have to fill the gaps, because there's also a huge financial gap for small and medium enterprises, particularly in the developing world, to ensure that they can now meet the new demand to the highest standards that allows for them to trade across borders. And therefore, with that context, I encourage its members to find concrete and proactive ways to seize the huge potential of trade policies, and also to help us to build back better, and also to propel us forward to a future that is green, clean, and that works for all. As a co-sponsor, Barbados is fully committed to the initiative that I outlined before. So once again, in my national capacity, you can count on the steadfast support that we have brought to the process, and we will encourage all others to do so. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Blackman. It's wonderful to hear both of your leadership at the WTO and your leadership back in Barbados, because both are beacons of light for what needs to be done. And you've called this a ground zero moment. I tend to agree with you. We have 10 years in the decade of action. We actually lost one to COVID, if I might say, and it really is time for all hands on deck. You know, as I was looking at the image on the slide as you were talking, it was garbage in the ocean. I quickly Googled the size of the garbage patch in the Pacific Ocean, which we've all heard of, 1.6 million square kilometers, 3 times the size of France, floating in the Pacific Ocean. So clearly there's a huge issue here that we haven't dealt with fully, and time is very short. This has been a wonderful scene setting. Ambassador, you've spoken to goings on at the WTO, and Carolyn, you sort of set a tableau for us. We're now going to shift gears and go a little deeper into more country action, so what's happening at the national level, but also perspective of a former chair of the WTO Trade and Environment Committee, your colleague who is now representing France as the permanent representative, Jean-Marie Poram. Jean-Marie, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Stephen, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to contribute to this panel. I think I'd like to build up on Chad Blackman's ground zero assertion, because it's true that up to now, I must recognize, I must say it's sad, but that the WTO has not been delivering much on its sustainable development agenda. And when I say the WTO, I'm not referring to some abstract entity. I mean, this is WTO members. This is us, which have been, by and large, maybe my friend Olim would not like what I'm saying, but by and large, WTO membership has been ignoring the environment in terms of deliverable. So I'd like to explore the way we can do better, and I think the things are really changing now. And explore that around 4 basic questions, which are why, when, what, and how. So the why thing is, why should the WTO do something first? And the answer is pretty straightforward, I think, because first, it has a mandate. We all know that the words sustainable development are part of the statutory objectives of the WTO, according to the Marrakesh Agreement, which creates the organization. And ironically, for the people who believe that the WTO is a free trade-oriented institution, the words free trade do not exist in the rule books, but sustainable development do exist in the rule book. The second element of the mandate is that the only one living multilateral negotiation these days is about environment. This is a fisheries negotiation. It has been mandated by the Sustainable Development Objective adopted by the head of states, and it's also a sustainable development negotiation. The second reason is that all the world around the WTO is now pushing toward having sustainable trade. The demand is very strong at the private sector level through corporate social responsibility initiative. The demand is very strong, the push is very strong at the bilateral and regional agreements level, and the EU, I believe, is spearheading this move with these environmental sustainable development chapters. And probably Stephen, you mentioned it, COVID could be an accelerator, at least of awareness about the links between sustainability and the global economy and trade, both as a problem and also as trade as a solution to sustainable development issues in that matter helps. So this is for the why question. The when, I think, has been explored by Chad Blackman in deep. Of course, there is in the short term the fisheries negotiation, which has failed to come to a conclusion 2 times now, in 2017 and in 2020. So it's a make or break thing. It has to happen this year, at least at the ministerial, which is forthcoming. But the most important thing are the plurilateral initiatives which have been undertaken within the WTO, quite discreetly, I must say, around the last CTE, both one on plastic, the other one is called FAST, FAST being the acronym of Friends of Advanced Sustainable Trade, which I think is groundbreaking, because there has been in the world economy 2 major transitions. One was a digital economy, was a greening of the economy. And the WTO has started to catch up with both of them. The first one was in Buenos Aires with the negotiation on electronic commerce. And the second one are those plurilateral initiatives that Chad was referring to, which are now starting. And I think it's a very promising news. Now, the third question is what can the WTO deliver? I think Caroline has been mentioning some aspects regarding the plastic, but more broadly, I think that it's very important that the WTO would concentrate on where its value added lies in global governance in order to contribute to the, and not duplicate, of course, to contribute to the whole system. And where is this value added? I think first, everywhere where there is a critical mass needed to avoid the free riding problem. The multilateral framework and the WTO can deal with the free riding problem. For instance, if you take the fisheries, it's a global issue because the fish does not know frontiers. So you cannot reform the subsidies at the regional or unilateral level. You have to do it worldwide. Other than that, it does not work. And I think Caroline was mentioning the global character of the plastic economy, and it fits very well into the kind of thing that the WTO can usefully contribute. So second thing is that the WTO has some lines of jobs that it does well and other things that it does not well. The WTO is not a standard setting institution or policy making, environment policy making institution. So it's not about elaborating from scratch a policy. But what the WTO does well is transparency cum analysis. So this is monitoring the flows and exchanging best practices, something it can do well. Binding. So if you have a policy that you have adopted at national level, why not bind it at the WTO? And sometimes liberalizing when possible. And this is also the essence of some proposition that the EU is coming with about liberalizing trade of goods and services on climate change. So this issue of value added, paying very modest, adding something where it can is very important if we want to move forward. Now, the last question is how. It's a most boring question. I said it's the most important one, admittingly. I think the key word is pragmatism. We have a locus. First principle, we may use it. The locus is a CTE. So we can start using the CTE as both an incubator and a catalyst for developing the WTO role. I think the WTO Environmental Week that Ambassador Blackman was referring to, and I pay tribute to you, Ambassador, for organizing that for the first time this year, is a very interesting setting, because this is a place where dialogue between trade negotiators and also civil societies and businesses can happen. So this input is very needed, and we need, that's the first principle, to use this locus. Second, I think it's important to go for concrete issues, very pragmatic issues. We have been trying the systemic, holistic, and you know the French, they like the systemic thing. I do like systemic thing, but we failed. This was the DDA. Article 31st of the DDA was mandating a negotiation about the relation between multilateral environment agreement and the WTO. This was holistic, very interesting, very fascinating, but it failed. So let's go concrete, and plastic is a good thing. There are other candidates. Fossil fuel subsidy reform has been identified possible candidate for discussion. Circular economy in general, climate change. This is the way to progress. Fourth principle, I think it's very important to work on issues which are of interest for developing and developed countries. The environment issue has been long seen as a rich man countries or rich countries issue. It is not. And the plastic issue is very interesting in that regard, because the coalition that was mentioned introducing the initiative in the WTO is a North-South coalition. It's not only developed countries. Last principle, I think we will need to succeed in the WTO on environment, a complete change of mindset. The WTO is dominated by its GATT legacy, and the GATT legacy is about, we are here to exchange trade concession. So give me this, I'll give you that, tit for tat, and hard law. So you have to exchange and make it a rule enforceable. I think for the environment, it's a completely different mindset. We need to cooperate for creating some sort of public good. So it's more like the difference between the GATT and the Paris Agreement type of international cooperation methodology. And this means that in the WTO, we have to start thinking to a vast array of norms, which may not be hard law, which may involve soft law, which may involve opt-in, optional opt-in, like we did, for instance, with the trade facilitation agreement. Countries can choose, pick and choose their menu where they're comfortable, and also bring into not necessarily equivalent contribution at the same time, but building on, adding on to create this public good. For instance, Ambassador Blackman was referring to the ban on single-use plastic in Barbados. It's also a policy that has been adopted very boldly in the EU. So could we think, I'm speaking personally here, of course, could we think of, if we do not use, if we ban on our domestic market single-use plastic, why should we export them? Can we ban the export of such single-use? That's a way, that's a contribution. We just don't need to have a counterpart with another trade concession from other people. Maybe I'm a little bit dreaming here, but I think it's a ground zero moment. It's time to really change the approach. And how could I wrap this up? I think if you take the principle that I've been suggesting, the plastic issue ticks more or less all the boxes. It's a very concrete issue. There is clear and present danger. We have seen the garbage slide presented. It's a north-south issue. There are also as many interests in developing countries as in developed countries. There is a chance to find a critical mass in the WTO to complement regional and other initiatives. And there is room for different national approaches to combine and to contribute together to some public good. I'll stop there, and thank you again for giving me the floor.
Thank you very much, Jean-Marie. I think you've actually laid us a very interesting roadmap, pragmatism, vision, concrete steps, creating alliances across North and South for common good issues like plastic waste. It's a very compelling vision. And I'm delighted that we have Ho Lim following directly on the heels of your what you've just shared with us. Because Ho, of course, is more than an avid spectator. He's a participant in all of this as Director of Trade and Environment at the WTO. So Ho, I'm going to pass it over to you and ask you also to pick up on some of these threads that both Chad Blackman and Jean-Marie Parum have put onto the table as current and prior chairs of the Trade and Environment Committee. And perhaps on that same spirit, Ho, also your thoughts about pathways forward for creating more progress on the issue of plastics and trade. Over to you, Ho.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Very good to see Jean-Marie, Chad, Caroline, all the panelists who've really given such a vast and very deep understanding of the issues and the challenges that we face. So I'm sort of wondering a little bit, what more can I add? And if you allow me, I'm going to do basically improvise a little bit. Originally, I was going to come and speak very specifically about the initiative and trying to elaborate a little bit further about the type of topics and subjects that might be picked up by this initiative. But listening to the very inspiring discussions and the challenges, I think I need to begin with a sort of very basic conceptual governance point that is sometimes missed. I mean, we talked a lot about WTO. We've spoken much less about WTO members. I think Jean-Marie certainly raised that point. Now, I raised this point with a little bit of trepidation because WTO members pay my salary. So, you know, one doesn't want to criticize too much, you know. But that being said, I know they also understand that, you know, the system as it is basically about WTO members. And the WTO members are the same ones in Basel, Stockholm, Rotterdam, to greater or lesser extents. In fact, it probably matches almost completely. Not completely, but almost completely. They are also the same members in the UN. They are also the same members in UN Environment. So when we speak about going forward on trade and plastics, and we speak about plastics action, we speak about trade action, that's where the gap is not the only gap, but I think it's certainly an important gap that needs to be bridged. I have, as you said, Steve, observed a lot of discussions at the WTO. That's really the role of the Secretariat. In fact, you know, we're not really participants. We're basically watching the participants. The participants are the WTO members. And at the same time, I've also seen the same participants speak in UN fora, UN Environment, BSR, and so forth. So if we're going to make progress on this, I think governments, and it may be a strange thing to say, but governments have to speak to themselves within the government itself. The representative to trade has to speak to its environment representative. The environment representative has to speak to its trade representative. And then they have to come to these organizations representing their governments. And it's true there that we can make some progress. And that's why we have the Committee on Trade and Environment at WTO, is to try to facilitate that process of governments speaking with each other, and also governments speaking internally between themselves. And that has been what we've seen in the struggle, if I can say. It's been difficult. Jean-Marie has already laid that out. So has Chad Blackman, so has Caroline. It's been a difficult conversation. And why is it difficult? I think there are many reasons for it, but certainly this is one coherence challenge that needs to be addressed. That being said, of course, it's very positive that some members are taking up this challenge. And that's where I think the informal dialogue has great potential to actually further this dialogue of coherence. And at the end of the day, making sure that we get to the results that everybody desires on trade and on plastics, and making sure that, you know, that the actions of governments really represent themselves in each and every of these forums. More specifically on the topics for the dialogue. And here, I can only tell you what we know based on what the proponents have told us or told publicly to the committee. They've listed 6 areas. The 6 areas are improving transparency, monitoring trade trends, promoting best practices, strengthening policy coherence, identifying the scope for collective approaches, assessing capacity and technical assistance needs, and cooperating with other international processes and efforts. So I think this really captures actually everything that everyone has already said so far on the panel. So it's the sort of basis of work that the proponents have laid out. And so the emphasis here, I think, is on identifying opportunities for enhanced trade cooperation within rules and mechanisms of WTO, and of course to support efforts in other fora. They're not starting completely without precedent, in the sense that there has already been discussions in the Committee on Trade and Environment, as Ambassador Blackman laid out, on the subject of plastics. Members themselves already have their own initiatives nationally, regionally, as well as internationally. So there's a big range of efforts out there. Let me provide a little bit of detail. What do we mean by trade supporting efforts? What types of measures are there? Here, I'm going to look a bit at the WTO Environmental Database. The database basically scans all notifications to the WTO. And here, it basically adds more detail to what's already been said. We see that measures notified to WTO have been increasing annually. And between 2010 to 2018, the annual average rate has been 20% of measures notified to combat plastic pollution. And of these measures, we looked at about 128 measures between 2009 and 2018. There are possibly many more measures out there that have not been notified to WTO, but as a sample, these 128 have been quite illustrative. The measures here range from technical regulations for better waste management, import licensing schemes to regulate trade flows of certain plastics, to taxes, to charges, or, as has been said, bans on single-use plastics or plastic bags. I think what's interesting to note is that technical regulations and conformity assessment procedures are by far the most common type of plastic-related measure notified to the WTO. Together, these measures represent almost 2/3 of all notified plastic measures. So very much regulatory.
I'm just going to give you a 1-minute warning here, because to be fair to other panelists, and I said before I would have my yellow Post-its, which I didn't use on our ambassadors out of politeness, but I will start to use with you and our other panelists. The 1-minute wrap-up.
At WTO, we understand discrimination, so that's fine. There are many things more that I could say about trade measures. So let me fast forward a little bit to looking at areas by which we could hope the informal dialogue might get into. So one of this is, of course, trade flows in plastics. And here, information is scarce, because of the complexities that Caroline already mentioned about whether plastics are traded as waste, whether it's embedded in products, and so forth. Problems of classification related to that. So plastics dialogue would be really helpful to shed more light on this. We've talked about circular economy, sustainable plastics economy. We haven't spoken much about supply chains and reverse supply chains. What sort of regulatory obstacles are there in terms of technical regulations, standards, obstacles to sorting, collection, repurposing, and so forth? International standards, clearly very important. But what are these international standards and who is coming up with them? And will there be adherence to them? These are things that need to be considered. Capacity, already spoken of. Aid for trade, enhanced integrated framework are vehicles that could be looked at. And we need to consider also quality infrastructure for developing countries to meet standards. So there are capacity gaps to be addressed. And lastly, I think people have spoken less about this, but so let me have my last 1 minute on this, which is on uniquely trade type opportunities. And this is about removing trade obstacles to disseminate technology for plastic substitutes and or biodegradable plastics, trade opportunities and obstacles to scaling up investment in waste management infrastructure, to increasing resource efficiency through circular economy supply chains, and ways to promote trade in plastic alternatives. And very concretely, when we go into that area, we're talking about whether there are tariffs that need to be reduced or removed, whether there are non-tariff barriers that need to be reduced or removed, whether it's in goods, whether it's in services, are there perverse subsidies that need to be removed? So I think all of this is going to be part of the conversation, at least I hope it would be. So with that, let me finish, and thank you for your indulgence, Steve. Thank you.
Not at all. Didn't mean to take the wind out of your sails at all, Ho. I do have a question for you, a follow-up. You've been a WTO observer and participant for many years. Is there anything different now? Do you feel that something has changed?
No, certainly. I mean, things have changed, as Chad was saying, that, the conversation on trade and environment has been moving much more towards what can we do? And there's a more of, if you like, more confidence that trade could approach these issues. And we hope that this can continue. At least I hope it can continue.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Ho. Well, colleagues, this has been all basically scene setting and a sort of a deep dive into WTO and the Trade and Environment Committee at the WTO with the current chair and the former chair. We're now moving into a segment which is a bit more on the relationship to other parts of the international fora, for also more of a technical approach to what can be some of the solutions and the pathways forward. So we have three more speakers. The first one is actually from the Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm Convention, which I think several of you have alluded to as a key player, a key part of the puzzle in sort of enhancing our governance of trade in plastics. And how the point you made about standards and secondary markets, how do we know when plastic is a waste versus when plastic is a resource? Those kind of distinctions. So for that, we have Amelie Tofwijk. She's a legal officer at Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm. And Amelie, looking forward to your views on this as well.
Thank you very much. And all the previous interventions said a lot, and I'm going to echo what was said previously, and thanks, Hui. I fully support and would like to echo the concrete themes that you've mentioned. And I would like to start by a positive note, because I've been looking at the crossroads of these issues, international trade, environment, for some years now. And there has been a shift, first started by the SDG, the UN umbrella 2030 agenda. And there are things before, whether at the forum of the Committee on Trade and Environment or within the MEAs, that I don't hear anymore. And the big leap forward was made by plastic. And thanks to plastic, okay, now everyone agrees. And I don't hear anymore at the CT, for example, by members, well, why are we discussing these issues? These are environmental issues. We're discussing about trade issues. And also in the MEA's forum say, oh, but what we're doing, there's no overlap with what they're discussing at the WTO. It left me a bit puzzled. And thanks to first the SDGs and now plastic, there's no question. I don't hear this kind of reflections at the different international forum. Because I mean, it left me puzzled, because even in this legally binding agreements, and the Basel Convention is, as Caroline recalled, is the only one dealing with plastic. These regimes, WTO regimes on one hand, and the MEAs on the other hand, are mutually supportive. It's even written down in some of the preamble of the conventions, and these conventions were born. Well, for the Basel Conventions, it's 1992, so just a bit before the WTO agreements. But the two sister conventions, the Rotterdam Convention on pesticides and chemicals, which is very much trade-oriented, it's written in the preamble, and the preamble was written in 1998. So the positive note is that thanks to plastic, I don't think we will hear these kind of dichotomy in between these two communities, and the fact that we're all together discussing now is very encouraging, because even if indeed I agree with the fact that we still have silos, and now I'm jumping in the second part of what I wanted to say initially. Well, the solution to fill the gaps and the barriers, there are still strong silos, and a concrete one is that when you sit at one forum and one international forum and at the other one, sometimes you have different people, or sometimes you have the same people, because, well, for example, in Geneva, which is the forum for negotiations, some countries have actually two missions, one UN mission, one WTO mission. And countries, developing countries in particular, they don't have the resources to have an economic mission or a political one, as they say. And therefore, the same person, you see the same faces sitting at the Basel Convention COPs or at the WTO CT and WTO negotiations. So this is one of still big gap at different level, whether multilateral level, the different international forum, at the regional level as well, and at the national levels. And the ministries, they still, even if the silos are being reduced, they don't talk to each other. You have Ministry of Trade going in one direction, Ministry of Environment, and we see it at the Basel Convention, BRS conventions, because they are at the crossroads of health, environment, trade issues. And at the national level, governmental level, you have different ministries and agencies to look at these issues in one sidetracked. And thanks to the debates on sustainability, there are bridges which are built in between these gaps, but it's not enough. There's still some work to do and some concrete work. So how do we do? Basel Convention. Well, I won't go into details into the amendments. Just mentioning one big milestone is the 1st of January this year, where the entries became effective, the entries that were adopted through the plastic waste amendment, because like the WTO, the Basel Convention is party-driven. So it is the parties, the countries that deliver the mandate, that decide on the mandate, and then adapt the mandate to the challenge that have to be addressed. And in 2019, as you all know, you had the plastic waste amendment, which were adopted twofold: the new entries, which came into force last month, and the creation of the largest partnership in the Basel Convention history on plastic waste. It was launched in March, and to date, you have at least 50 governments, IGOs, academia, NGOs. So really something which reflects a 360-degree vision. And to come back on the solution, yes, more international cooperation to avoid the silo at the different geographical level, but also at within the different sectors. And this 360-degree vision is to be more inclusive of the private sector, because also, especially regarding plastic, they have a great role to play. And there was, even if it's being reduced with time, the governmental sector and the private sector. And we see it, well, the UN, MEAs, or the WTO, and then, but what about the markets? What about the ones who put their hands in the concrete things? So with this partnership, there are solutions that are being sought. There have been some calls for pilot projects, especially to help developing countries in, and that's an issue to address still, is how do you implement and enforce what has been adopted under the scope of the Basel Convention? We have this beautiful amendment. I see the yellow card, so I will shorten. So the second focus on the solution is as to implementation, and all intergovernmental organizations, and especially legally binding treaties, have this issue, and this has to be worked on. I like the idea of soft law, which Jean-Marie Pogam mentioned, because with soft law, you can have a lot of things going through without the commitments, like legally binding commitments, with which many governments are not comfortable with. So under the Basel Convention, there's a lot of work being done and still to be done, because there's still much, much more to do. These plastic amendments are just the beginning of a journey. We're having our COPs meetings, well, delayed, supposed to happen this year, but they're going to be delayed. But this is where decisions can be taken, mandate can be specified on concrete areas that Hui just mentioned, because we are in the end party-driven, and we cannot move if not there's no consensus. So that's my conclusion. I will leave the floor to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Emily. Thanks very much. I'm sure we're going to come back to you, because everyone's curious about BRS. What is it? How does it operate? How does it fit with the WTO? How do you work together? Those questions, I mean, they're very basic questions in a way, but I'm sure many people in the audience may have those kinds of questions. And to our panelists, the chat box is filling up as we speak. So I encourage you to go have a look at the chat box. And if there's a particular question that you either want to respond to or can respond to in writing, provide some links, please feel free to do so. That will help me to eliminate some of the follow-up questions, because it's quite a good interactive space. Well, colleagues, our next speaker is known to many of you. He's from UNCTAD, David Vivas. He's a legal officer in the Office of the Director at the Division of International Trade and Commodities at UNCTAD. And David's also very active in the blue economy as well, as Carolyn alluded to. So David, over to you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you for the invitation to all the organizers. First of all, I would like to recall that SDG 14.1 talks about significantly reduced marine pollution. So it's very much in the agenda of all of us, even at the head of the states level. That's number one. Second, I would like to mention that whatever I'm going to present today is based on a recent research with my colleague Diana Barrow-Block, and I will be presenting some new findings we were doing for research from the Commonwealth. Next slide, please. The first thing is when we try to link plastic pollution with oceans is that we have a downstream effect. Plastic pollution arrives to the ocean, it's not created at the oceans. We estimate that about 8 million tons arrive to the oceans and seas each year. That's about 3% only of all the plastic produced. So only with 3%, we have 6 huge plastic patches all over the oceans. Stephen, you mentioned one, a very big one in the Pacific. But this is again the surface of the problem in the oceans of plastic. There is an unseen problem. That is that plastic tends to float about only 2 years on the surface of the oceans after it sinks. So now divers are setting as a benchmark to know if they're really at the bottom when they start to see plastic bottles at the ocean. So this is very sad that is happening. So there is a huge accumulation of plastic pollution at the bottom and nobody's seeing that. This is similar to the problem of hidden plastic in packaging. So there are areas that nobody follows. Also, as UNEP has said very well, if we continue like that, there will be more plastic than fish by 2050. That's why we need to act not only in plastic, but in relation to fish subsidies. Biodegradability is not an absolute solution because even if the plastics dissolve or erode, they may become microplastic and can be ingested by different species and made part of the food chain. And there are scientific studies that are already saying that these had adverse effects on health and animal species. We also have to say that plastic have a very bad impact on all blue economy sectors, fisheries, aquaculture, tourism, and even transport. And these sectors are key for small island development states. They suffer from hurricanes, now COVID, lack of connectivity. So I think they already have a lot of problems to be adding this one, no? So a point that is making a big debate on plastics is that this is a useful material for protective products under the COVID-19, but again, many of these products are also ending in rivers and at the ocean, so the problem is increasing. Next slide, please. Caroline was mentioned the size of the trade in plastic. Here you have the most recent data that we have provided on that coming from the prototype that I just shared at the chat. More than $1 trillion, about 330 million tons of plastics. In the case of the oceans, most of the plastic pollutants arriving are mostly final product, consumer products, plastic textile, plastic packaging, etc. Now, I'm particularly worried among these categories with the plastic textiles, synthetic materials. Basically, these synthetic materials in the form of clothes, but also in the form of fishing nets, abandoned fishing nets, have a huge negative impact on marine life, mammal, fish, etc. They keep fishing and killing species even if they have been abandoned as they afloat. So it is a very direct impact on the fauna at the ocean and even on other species. Interestingly, seeds, small island development states, only trade export about $15 billion. This is less than 1% of all exports worldwide. We have with them a similar problem that we have in climate change. They are not the cause of the problem, but they will have to pay the bill. So it's an element that we have to consider. Next slide, please. Now, besides, we have done some analysis based on the WTO Trade Environment Database. I think it's a fantastic tool, and we thank them for the effort. We have done some analysis, but we have gone deeper. We decided to look at existing regulations in seeds and small economies. Here you have an example of 10 regulations adopted since 2015, including Barbados, that he was mentioning. Most of them are linked to single-use plastics. Most of them apply bans, but also regulations and taxes. But the level of notification of the WTO, if you see in this case, is less than 20%. So 2 key messages. First, we need to increase the notifications at WTO to follow up and be able to have a better picture. But second, we're seeing only the tip of the iceberg. It means that many countries are really concerned about this, and we need to have a better understanding of the regulatory mapping to really understand key things on regulation, including regulatory distance, prevalence, scope, and the content of those regulations. So we may have elements for future reform, whether in the WTO or in the United Nations, because countries are already doing things. Perhaps we're not seeing them very clearly. Next one, please. Then some key messages is each of these bullet points need a paper. So I just will try to go to some of them to showcase what can we do. I think one key element is that in the circular economy, we tend to talk about reduce, reuse, and recycle. I think we need to add a new verb, which is to substitute. I think we need to not only look at how bad is plastic, we need to look at better environmental preferable materials. The beauty of that concept is that it's relative. It changes with technology, it changes with consumer patterns, it changes with the improvement of materials. So we need to look at substitutes that can perform similar functions and at the same time can have a less or lower impact on the environment. And we have developed a list, a preliminary list. We keep working on it, and we're doing some research on Africa and Asia that we will be doing this semester to show the reality of the potential of manufacturing and sun-rays industries in the case of plastic substitutes, meaning non-plastics, meaning natural fibers, agricultural waste, and other type of materials. I think we need to undertake a detailed mapping of non-tariff measures applicable to plastics and plastic alternatives and substitutes. We need to go beyond the WTO Train Environment Database. We can contribute with analysis and data of the UNTAC Trains database that includes NTMs, and we could also start compiling measures that are not included in those to have a better mapping. That could be something that members may request if need be. We can also think about reducing tariff and address MTF for plastic substitutes and alternatives, again, for better materials. Many are talking on the priority on relaunch or resurrect the environmental good and service negotiation. Well, this could be a good element to be included. We shouldn't only focus on industrial goods, but also on natural-based products, following the natural-based solution slogan by UNEP. Now, we need to also look, yellow card, sorry, I'll do my best. We need to also look at environmental services. The case of waste management is a service, it's underdeveloped in many developing countries. We do not link to think about liberalization, but also about harmonizing regulation. If we go into that path, we may need minimum regulatory principles that we have in telecom or we have in financial services. I would say I will stop on the trade part, but on the potential management response of quick messages. First, we need to understand better how to deal with different type of waste, different type of plastics. I like to use plural more than singular. This is very important in light of the Basel Convention Amendment. Countries need to understand very well what they are dealing with for the purposes of trade, transforming niche codes, but also for the purposes of internal management. We need to increase communication and coordination internally because a lot of the regulation and waste management are at the municipal and local level, not national. So there are not economies of a scale, of a scope, and sometimes not even internal coherence of how to manage. There are many other recommendations. I won't continue. I just will do one last slide that you can read if you need to see more. But I think we could think to make use of opportunities, and Ambassador Blackman is not here, but he should be our champion, to introduce a sustainable trade and development plastic initiative into the multilateral trade system. UNTAC can help. We can also provide platforms for multi-year expert meetings. We can develop soft law. There are many tools that could help to get closer to the goal, have been mentioned by the Basel representative. So this conference will take place in October, potentially 3 months before the WTO ministerial. So we need to have the entire multilateral trade system working and supporting each other jointly with the sustainable development goals. Thank you very much for the time. Sorry if I was too long.
Thank you, David. No, very interesting. I felt terrible raising the yellow card because it's fascinating. I do have one sort of quick follow-on question for you, though. You had a very extensive list of potential trade or management responses. If there's one that you feel is ready, that we're ready for that one trade response, what's at the top of your list?
Well, in UNTAC, we're trying to believe that we're seeing that in terms of trade, we need to develop the opportunities for plastic substitutes, again, non-trade plastic materials.
Yeah.
Why? Because they need low technology. They're available in developing countries, which a lot of the pollution is happening and where most of the consumers are found, and we can scale up rather quickly without huge or incremental changes in technology. So that, and trade can really help to reduce tariff and non-tariff barriers in that area.
Okay, excellent. Thanks very much, David. Well, this is a great segue to our last speaker, who is Alice Tipping from the International Institute for Sustainable Development. She's a specialist in fishery subsidies, but I think she could also speak to any sort of subsidy which distorts the market. And I think that's a bit what you're speaking to, David, when you're talking about the substitutes. So Alice, over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Stephen. Let me know if you can't hear me well. But, you know, the previous speakers have, I think, laid out the broad sort of policy problem and identified the range of technical options and provided some really interesting comments on kind of the governance approaches and considerations that we need to bear in mind as we think about the role that trade policy might have in helping to address the broader plastics pollution problem. The organisers have asked me to focus on one very specific part of this problem, subsidies. So that gives me the opportunity and the luxury to be very succinct and very concrete, which also in the interest of time, I'll try and be. So, you know, we're talking about subsidies to plastics. This is one of the problems that the other speakers have talked about. And it's a problem that trade policy tools would seem to be a particularly useful way or particularly useful for tackling. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do know, what we don't know, and what we might be able to do next on subsidies in the plastics context. So what do we know? We know that one of the main underlying problems fueling the oversupply of plastics in the global economy is that primary plastics are extremely cheap. This makes substitutes for plastics less competitive. It also makes recycling of plastics less competitive, because sometimes it can be cheaper simply to buy a new one than it can be to recycle. We know that plastics are produced from fossil fuels. We know that fossil fuel production is heavily subsidized in many places. And we know that both fossil fuel production and the production of plastic feedstocks are also very concentrated in a small number of countries. We also know that some, and I think this was mentioned at the very beginning, Carolyn mentioned it, we know that 60% of primary plastics are traded internationally. So when you think of all of those particular sort of points of information we do know, that means that the subsidization of primary plastics is likely to impact plastic production and use around the world. So subsidies, particularly to fossil fuels at the beginning of the value chain, are important to look at. So that's what we do know. Very broadly. What do we not know? We don't know exactly how much the subsidies to fossil fuel production, that's at the very beginning of the value chain, impact on the production of plastics further along the value chain. But given the scale of their impact, the impact of subsidies on fossil fuel production, we can assume that their impact along the value chain is probably considerable. We don't know precisely what subsidies are provided further along the value chains. So subsidies for petrochemicals, subsidies for the production of plastic inputs, and subsidies even for the production of final plastic products, bottles or straws. And we know a bit, but not yet enough, I don't think, about the production and the market dynamics of subsidization for different kinds of products, of plastics. So very briefly, what do we need to do next? We need to learn. We need to gather data on the types of subsidies, the scales of subsidies, who provides them, and what their trade and environmental impacts could be. We also need to learn from previous attempts to reform subsidies. We can learn lessons from the domestic reform of subsidies, including subsidies to fossil fuels. We can also learn lessons from the multilateral reform of subsidies, the fishery subsidies negotiations, which take up most of my time. We know it takes time. We know that it's best to keep ambition high, but focused and very realistic. And I think once we understand better exactly what the subsidy problem is and how it translates into the market realities, how it affects this global economy and the global market for plastics, we can start to identify the shape of different policy solutions. But those policy solutions have to be designed in accordance with what the data tells us the problem really is. So if part of the problem is subsidized production of fossil fuels or plastic feedstocks or something along the value chain by a few very large players, perhaps the solution looks more like an agreement amongst those particular producers to reduce their subsidies. If the problem is subsidization of fossil fuels, but also of production along the value chain, maybe we need a multilateral discussion about these subsidies, the impacts they have, and in a cooperative vein, what countries might be prepared to do to scale back their subsidization and the production of goods, which in many cases can be quite environmentally damaging. I'm going to actually make only one last point, but I think it's an important one. It was made at the beginning, but it's worth emphasizing here, is that trade policy solutions are only going to be one part of what governments do to address the plastic pollution challenge. We know there is a broad range of actors tackling the plastic pollution problem. Trade policy is not the single solution. It may not even be the main solution, but the global plastics economy is so global that trade and trade policy are going to be needed to support whatever domestic measures countries choose to take to address the broader problem. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Amazing, Alice. There's no yellow card. You don't get my Post-its. You're too disciplined. But I think in the WTO context, that's a very high compliment. Thank you very much for those remarks and for staying focused. And I actually want to pick up the thread that you've raised, and I think David also with the whole substitute question, and come back to you, Ambassador Blackman, within the context of the WTO Trade and Environment Committee. We've heard several times that fish subsidies has stalled, but is potentially there. It's sort of a make or break. I think somebody used that language, very close. Are there any analogies that you draw from the fish subsidy discussion in the WTO to the plastics discussion, similarities, parallels, or maybe things that don't map whatsoever? Would be grateful to hear your views on that. Perhaps you first, Ambassador Blackman, and then from Jean-Marie.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I'll be very brief because I know time is running out. I simply say between the two, for example, fisheries and the environment, the cross-cutting theme there is the issue of sustainability. When we look at the subsidies on fisheries, in terms of moving forward, how sustainable is it going to be if there's a high distortion of for example, members being able to subsidize the sector when it's going to be causing the overstocking or, well, the over harvesting and taking of fish stocks? When we also look then at the issue of trade and the environment, how do we build back a global economy now, particularly in the advent of COVID-19, that is sustainable, that allows for growth, but does not harm the environment? And that delicate balance has to be the hallmark between the two. And I think there is a growing consensus amongst members and also stakeholders outside of the WTO that growth must take place. There's no doubt fishing must take place, but it must be done in a way that is sustainable, that allows for longevity of the process, and also that does not cause for degradation further of the environment. And the environment question to fisheries is also very important because sometimes in the advent of overfishing, the ecosystem, the marine life is destroyed as a result. Because if sometimes you have an ecosystem where fish and the marine life there is not able to produce in the quantities that they are, you have sometimes the reefs being affected. So there's a very delicate balance, notwithstanding that the WTO is not a standard setting agency. There's that interface that has to take place as we go forward.
Yeah, thanks very much for putting that in context. Obviously, growth in return to growth is imperative, jobs, income, but perhaps not the growth that we had before, I think was one of the points that you made as well. And Jean-Marie, coming to you, because you had very concrete, pragmatic steps forward. You also mentioned the fish subsidy question, and sort of the plastic discussion is much newer on the scene. Based on what you've heard from Alice, from some of the other participants today, how would you shape next steps within the field that you see from your vantage point?
Well, first of all, I have to remind that I'm representing France as part of the EU, so shaping next step would be an EU endeavor. I have to remind you that. But of course, I think that we need to use the CTE. The CTE is a unique locus in the WTO for one reason. It is not a negotiating body, and it's not agreement managing body. So this is the only place where you are free to talk without having your a risk to have your hands tied up. So Of course, the plastic issue is a very new one, and this is precisely what needs to be done, is explore all the implication and the interaction and the relevant interaction with trade policy, which I agree with Alice, may not be the major tool to tackle the plastic issue, but would be one of them. Now, I'll take a comparison. For instance, 4 years ago, some members of the WTO decided to discuss about gender. And it's a very complicated issue to know what trade policy has to do with gender. Now, of course, gender is as a principle, gender equality is a value which needs to be shared in all the policies. But for trade policy, it's not easy. But they started discussing, and we are going to find trade policy entry. It will not be the major entries to solve the gender issue. Of course, education, health policy have much more of a lead in that field, and other. But it's the same thing with all the sustainable objectives policies, the environment policy. We need to explore that. We need to discuss that. And there is a sort of maturity model in the trade and environmental discussion. For instance, for the trade people, they like environment when environment can be combined with liberalization. It's a so-called win-win. So environment is good if you can liberalize. That's an interesting step, and this was the EGA rationale. But we need to go further. The next step is about how do you integrate the environment within the business model of trade. And this has to be explored. Nobody has an answer beforehand, and this is a role, I think, of the CTE or the plurilateral dialogue, which will be developing around the CTE.
Yeah, no, very interesting. And when I think of the Circular Economy Action Plan, for example, which is a cornerstone of Europe's steps forward, and I think how that could perhaps play into trade issues, right? Because essentially, how do you add value while reducing your waste streams? Makes it very, very interesting. And how do you create growth, which actually is beneficial not only to countries, to jobs, to income, but actually reduces that environmental impact that we spoke about earlier? There's been some really interesting comments in the chat box as well. The ones coming from the Center for International Environmental Law. They're also talking about the potential global agreement on plastics governance. And here, this is outside of the WTO, obviously, but potentially having an impact on the WTO. Ho, I wanted to go to you next on that one. What kind of significance could this have for the WTO? What kind of significance could this have also for BRS, the relationship between BRS and WTO?
No, thanks, Stephen. I think actually just very quickly that on the one of the points you finished with, I think we need a lot to hear from the private sector, precisely what you said about how can they integrate many of these things and to create opportunities. Because I think we all agree that it's about shifting the economy, shifting growth, shifting trade. And the people who can do this are the private sector. So I think they need to be brought into the conversation, and they have been, I know, throughout the series of discussions that you've been having. And that's where some of the opportunities at WTO could lie as well, of the dialogues. On the global agreement question that you had, I guess it depends on how it ends up, and depends on how you structure those discussions and what you have at the end of it. If you're looking at a new multilateral environmental agreement, I guess that's the hint that you're going towards in your question. And here it will be, again, the issue of coherence between WTO and multilateral environmental agreements. And we have the experience of that coherence with the BRS. I mean, at Secretariat level, we work very well with the BRS, and they are always briefing and they're always providing inputs to the CTE, and vice versa from WTO to the BRS process. At the more governmental level, that coherence will have to be brought about through the government delegates. Those who participate in the two processes will have to be the ones to ensure coherence. At the more legal side, so far we've not had any disputes involving an MEA. Could that happen? Yes, it could happen, but so far it hasn't happened. So that is something to watch, of course, and I don't have time to go into it, but there's a long discussion about jurisprudence around WTO and MEAs. Just to say that so far the jurisprudence has shown that members can take whatever measures they need to safeguard whatever environmental objective they wish to go ahead with. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Ho. I'm going to leave that question there for the moment. Emily, I'm actually going to come back to you on that. But Ho, you brought up a thread which is very interesting, which is private sector in innovation. And David also spoke to this when he was talking about substitutes. David, what do you see in terms of a private sector role in solving the plastics conundrum in the face of perhaps asymmetric capacities on trade? Or you mentioned that actually for substitute, it's not that far of a leap for many countries to make this a north-south issue. David?
Thank you. Very relevant question. I think innovation will play a significant role in what type of materials could be used for the future. I think private sector role to source in different sources of material that have less environmental impact will be key. And also consumers, very importantly consumers. Consumers will force the private sector, are a strong driving force, and consumer patterns are starting to change. Each time somebody starts looking at their own plastic bottle of water, sometimes ask, is this necessary? No? I would say that on innovation, a lot of possibilities. I mentioned plastic substitutes that are available already under current technology for developing countries, so again, they can be scaled up quickly. But you can have other changes in design, changes in the amount of volume of plastic use, or again, changes in the type of materials if they are more environmentally friendly, but also changes in business models, in modalities for deliver, as you have in the supermarket, less plastic bags, get your own bag and get the dispenser. So there are many ways where innovation can help. Obviously, there are those that are protected through IP, especially if they are new, novel, and have an industrial application, but there are others that are low cost and simpler to get, such as industrial designs and utility models.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I really like to explore that further, because we hear about degradable plastics or biodegradable plastics, and the image of all this plastic dropping from the surface of the ocean, you know, it's just simply heart-wrenching to think about all that going into the food chain, and of course then we all eat it. Amelie, I want to come to you on the governance question again, because here we've talked about the Committee for Trade and Environment, we've talked about the WTO, which is itself the governance framework for trade, and BRS sort of being a new entrant into that field. There's the possibility of a global agreement around plastics. How do you see these things working together, moving in the same direction?
Good question. Well, being from the Basel Convention Secretariat, I would advocate for improving the existing tools, because we see that at the governance levels, I mean, intergovernmental negotiations can take time to arrive at a consensus on a common outcome, and the reality has its challenges. So I would more advocate for improving what we have, not discarding the hot topic of the new global treaty on plastics. Although being a lawyer, I think there are some alternatives to legally binding instruments in order to concretely move things forward and at the pace of the business world.
Okay.
As I mentioned, there's sometimes the gap in between the intergovernmental governance level and the markets. So I hope this.
So we can do better with what we have, is what I hear you saying, and I see David nodding enthusiastically along. Carolyn, we're almost where we need to stop, and I want to come back to you for some final remarks, because you're an astute observer of trade. Before going back to Diana, and your thoughts on where this conversation has gone and what we want to take away from it.
Gosh, thank you, Stephen. That's a big question to end with. So one thing I think, a message that I have gotten out of it is this importance of coherence between these different policy-making forums, that we need to see them as complementary, and a lot of that starts at home. So we're not going to get anywhere with the trade aspects of this and with helping business to make the transition if people won't be open to having environment and trade discussions at the WTO. You know, so we need to have environment ministries engaged in that, and we also need to have trade ministries listening to their environmental counterparts about what really are the priorities, where is the evidence, what's really the high impact things that need to happen. So I think that coherence thing is really important, especially nationally. And the other thing I was going to say, it links a little bit to Amélie's point, is that on all of these issues, we have enormous capacity constraints at the national level to implement, whether it's environment policies and trade-related environmental policies and laws. So I think we really need to put a lot of this energy and political energy into that, because that's going to make a big difference. And then the third thing is back to the WTO and why I think it's so important that we look and we should be excited about the interest of governments in engaging there, is because at the end of the day, we need business to move. We need the economy to be transformed. Yeah. And so we need environmental regulation, environmental policymakers to set the bar high, but it's going to be economic policy that will help us also to get there. And I think there we really need to acknowledge that because the global plastics economy is global, as I've said, many, many countries have an interest in parts of this value chain. They're going to have things to lose. They're going to have things to gain from alternatives and substitutes. But it's going to be a complex thing to work out. And that's why we should be cheering the fact that we have a set of trade negotiators who are interested in helping tackle this problem and bringing that they have to bear to be part of that solution.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Carolyn. You know, I'm recalling what Chad Blackman said, all hands on deck. And I think that summarizes in some ways what you've said. Alice, we've shortchanged you a little bit because you were so precise and razor sharp in your comments. Is there anything you want to add to the three things that Carolyn's put on the table from takeaway messages?
Frankly, no. I think that summarized it all extremely well.
Okay, so I got coherence begins at home. Don't forget about capacity constraints. And let's get business involved in this transformation. So, and going to your point about subsidies and market efficiency, we also know that we have to remove distortions if markets are truly going to be effective. So maybe I'll just throw that out there as well. And with that, colleagues, I'd like to thank you very, very much for your contributions today, and particularly our two ambassadors who have been with us throughout the entire conversation. And with that, Diana, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Stephen. First, I will start by thanking you, Stephen, for brightly moderating this session, and also to thank all our panelists, but also all the guests who are still with us. So thank you all.